Thank you very much indeed, Sid, for that warm introduction. It's lovely to be back in Melbourne. I know this looks as if it was a piece of extremely well-considered timing, but actually I need to thank Jason Chang, the chairman of ACBC Victoria, for his very nice letter to me in about February this year saying, could I please come and help you celebrate the 40th anniversary? And I wrote back and said, look, I have no particular plans to visit Victoria, but if I do, I'll let you know. Well, those plans changed, but little did I know it would have been, my visit would have been a week or so after the Prime Minister launched the White Paper, and to Melbourne the day after the 18th Party Congress started to meet in Beijing. I will be hurrying back in time for the unveiling next week, which we've all been waiting for. But can I first acknowledge Shu Weiqiang, the Consul General of the People's Republic of China, and also the Consul General of Indonesia. Jason, very nice to see ACBC here. But I'd also like to acknowledge Jenny McGregor, and through her and you, Sid, all the work that AsiaLink does, all the wonderful work that AsiaLink does. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to be here this afternoon at the invitation of AsiaLink and the Australia-China Business Council to talk about a topic of keen interest to us all, the remarkable relationship between Australia and China from a Victorian vantage point. I think, Jenny let the cat out of the bag a little bit earlier on by acknowledging that Victoria is actually, I wouldn't say there's a competition necessarily between the 6 states and the 2 territories, but if there were one, I think you would be quite comfortably placed, as it were. The Asian Century White Paper, released by the Prime Minister 10 days ago, set out ambitious targets for Australia's Asia literacy. I think we only need to look at the fine work done by AsiaLink to see there are already many engaging in this important conversation, and it's a privilege to be able to contribute to it today. I follow a number of recent high-level speakers to address the ACBC Victoria branch, including Victorian Premier Ted Baillieu, who last month launched the interim report of his head-turning, it certainly was, and very valuable super trade mission to China. Another recent speaker was the Federal Minister for Resources, Energy and Tourism, Martin Ferguson, one of a number of ministers to have visited China this year. Even the Melbourne Cup has travelled to China this year, and I'm delighted to be in Melbourne during the Spring Racing Carnival being held at Flemington this week. It's an exciting week to be in Melbourne, but when isn't it? In fact, I was in Sydney on Monday night, and my flight from Singapore arrived early enough for me to go to the Wine Library in Paddington. Some of you may know it. And as I left later in the evening, the barman said to me, "Good luck for tomorrow." And I thought, how does he know what I'm doing tomorrow? I was speaking to the Asia Society, I was briefing the Reserve Bank, I was doing all sorts of things. And then as I stepped out onto the pavement, the penny dropped. Sydney siders pretend they ignore this event, but it was very clear as I left the Reserve Bank the following day, the throngs of people in Martin Place all lined up in a very orderly fashion at the TAB. By the way, my sweepstake in Beijing came to absolutely nothing. If it were March, of course, I'd be mentioning the Grand Prix, or September, the football finals. And if it were January, I'd be talking about the Australian Open and watching closely the performances of not only China's star Li Na, but also of the 2 Chinese players offered wildcard entry to the Open by Tennis Australia. And Tennis Australia, I should say, is really pursuing a very far-sighted strategy. I think Melbourne has the Grand Slam event for the Asia Pacific. Tennis Australia knows that needs to be shared and is developing through an MOU with China a very good relationship with its Chinese counterpart, and one which will assist China not only to develop more world-class tennis players, but also assist China to develop its own tennis competitions, aspiring, of course, to the standards of the Melbourne Open. But, Melbourne Open, I said that, didn't I? The Australian Open. And no one even picked me up on it. But engagement with China is not new to Victoria. In 1979, Victoria entered its sister state relationship with China's Jiangsu province. And only a year later, in 1980, Melbourne and Tianjin established the first sister-city relationship between the 2 countries. Of course, as your Premier is fond of saying, but let me acknowledge also, the people-to-people and trade links go back much further. when Chinese came to Victoria to mine, trade and do business in the goldfields in the 1850s. The new Australia, which grew from colonial roots with the discovery of Victoria's gold, was closely connected to China from the very beginning. According to the latest census, there are now 214,000 Victorians with Chinese ancestry and 94,000 people born in China who have migrated here. The dimensions and success of Australia's relationship with China are most easily described by trade figures, and they're worth hearing. It must have seemed unimaginable to our leaders when they established diplomatic relations with China in 1972 that two-way trade, then just $100 million a year, would 4 decades later exceed $120 billion. The most recent ACBC Trading with China Benefits to Australian Households report, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, estimates that on average, Australian households benefit by $10,500 from our economic relationship with China. The trade in goods between China and Victoria alone was worth almost $14.5 billion last year. This is more than the trade in goods between Australia, the whole of Australia, and the United Kingdom, and fast approaching that between Australia and New Zealand. In fact, the most recent Asia Link Index, launched 2 weeks ago, shows that Australia-China engagement grew from 2010 to 2011 across 6 of 7 indicators: trade, investment, research and business development, education, tourism and migration. These efforts combined to produce a remarkable 53.5% growth in engagement over a 12-month period. There are a myriad of events and exchanges which demonstrate the maturing relationship we share with China. Minister for the Arts, Simon Crean, will visit China next month to sign the 2012-2014 Australia-China Cultural Implementation Plan. I know that's something that Carrillo Gantner continues to take a very close interest in, and I want to acknowledge his contribution to the cultural engagement between our two countries, because cultural diplomacy drives stronger, deeper and broader bilateral engagement, and this plan will provide for more opportunities for arts engagement between our two countries. One shining example of already growing arts engagement is the relationship between the National Gallery of Victoria and China's Palace Museum. A memorandum of understanding signed by the two museums during the Super Trade Mission in September will pave the way for a fabulous exhibition from the Imperial Collection of the Palace Museum to be hosted by the NGV in 2015. Indeed, last month, the director of the Palace Museum, Shan Jixiang, told me personally how much he's looking forward to sharing the story of the Qianlong Emperor through this large exhibition, which will occupy over 1,000 square metres of the NGV. This exchange demonstrates how the relationship between Victoria and China exhibits the same features as our broader bilateral relationship: cooperation, collaboration and creativity. As we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations, this offers, I think, a point of inspiration from which to envisage the future for our two countries. I mentioned Victoria's $14.5 billion of trade in goods with China. However, where Victoria is showing promising growth in terms of trade engagement with China is in services. In the last financial year, Victoria welcomed 263,000 overnight visitors from mainland China. This is a 6-fold increase since 2000 and represents an annual growth rate greater than that of the nation. Victoria welcomes more Chinese visitors than Canada does and New Zealand does. The number of Chinese visitors to Victoria who travel to Sovereign Hill, about 20% of the total, I think, and to Phillip Island, another 20%, demonstrates the importance of Victoria's historical connections to China and the appeal of its clean environment and diverse wildlife. A recent development which will assist in attracting Chinese visitors is the announcement by Sichuan Airlines that it will fly direct from Chengdu to Melbourne. There are now 4 major Chinese airlines flying directly into Melbourne: Sichuan, Air China, China Southern and China Eastern, and the state's success in appealing to the Chinese holidaymaker, businessman, woman or investor is set to grow. As the home of a number of world-class educational institutions, Victoria is also an attractive destination for Chinese students. And according to figures released just this week, in 2011-12, the last financial year, international education activities brought $14.8 billion in export income to the Australian economy. $4.5 billion of that income was earned in Victoria, making international education the state's largest export earner. AsiaLink's 2012 index showed that while other major Asian student markets experienced declining demand in 2011, the number of Chinese students coming to Australia to study continued to grow. Around 30% of the Chinese students enrolled in Australia are studying in Victoria, and China is the state's largest source market of international students. But of course, education is not just about Chinese students coming here. The White Paper has set ambitious targets for education, both at the school and tertiary levels. Victoria's government is also investing in strengthening the state's Asia literacy, and this includes strong incentives for students to study Chinese to Year 12. And I should just say I had the most fabulous morning this morning at the Richmond West Primary School, which has had a bilingual teaching program for the whole of the primary school since 1982. They told me they've flown under the radar. Not many people know about this, but I've got to say those children, and they are from a variety of communities, they would have a similar, if I look at you and look at them, it's a similar sort of makeup. And they really stretched me this morning, sitting down and reading and talking to the Year 1s and 2s was quite manageable. By the time we got to 3s and 4s, I was feeling stretched, and by the time we got to the upper primary, they were seriously good, not just at speaking and reading, but also at writing. And they did so with a tremendous sense of enthusiasm that I hope the state education system will be able to maintain during their secondary years, because I'd be very keen to have some of them come and work for us in the embassy as interns in a little while. Of course, linguistic literacy is only one part of essential cultural literacy, a literacy best fostered through people-to-people links. People-to-people links is a broad description which regrettably hides much of what we really mean, the personal, family, community and institutional bonds that deliver the creativity, flexibility, drive and resilience that underpin the Australia-China relationship. People-to-people links are often born of institutional links, of course, and the Australia-China Alumni Association is a fine example of an organisation which is promoting cultural literacy through personal engagement. The association, of course it's China-based, now has almost 8,000 members and 30 Australian partner universities. And I'm pleased to see Michael Dulwich, although I can't see where he's sitting in the audience, but we were speaking earlier. While studying Chinese as an undergraduate, Michael first travelled to China to study at Nanjing University as an RMIT Young Ambassador. Michael stayed 4 years until just last week when he, in the role of the Australia-China Alumni Association's Director of Communications and Development Manager in Beijing. But he's back in Australia developing the next stage of his career, and I hope he'll continue to engage with China in future. Institutional engagement, such as that between universities, can give young people like Michael their first China experience. The continued self-motivated personal links that then develop are what gives the bilateral relationship its richness. Another program which will foster growth in cultural literacy is the Hamer Scholarships for Professionals to study in Jiangsu, fittingly named in honour of Sir Rupert Hamer, who established Victoria's sister state relationship with Jiangsu. The first scholarships were awarded in May, and recipients come from a wide range of sectors. This will enable professionals who perhaps had their first China experience as a student like Michael to pursue ongoing engagement. As our investment in education grows, so too does Chinese investment in Victoria continue to grow. At a national level, including through the work of the Embassy in Beijing, we continue to press for equal access to Chinese markets. Two-way investment brings great benefits to the people of Victoria. And a good example is the Qenos plant in Altona. Qenos is a subsidiary of ChemChina and has around 1,000 employees in Australia. And I know, although I didn't realise when I was writing my speech, that Robert Liu from Blue Star, ChemChina and Qenos is here in the audience as well. ChemChina President Ren Jianxin has told me that Qenos is a valuable asset in ChemChina's business. ChemChina is proud of its record of community engagement in Victoria, and Victoria has welcomed them and is benefiting from their presence. So I echo the comments made by Premier Baillieu in his speech to you last month. Victoria welcomes Chinese investment, Australia welcomes Chinese investment. My work takes me across China from west to east and south to north, as the Chinese say, Xidong Nanbei. But it has also taken me to the iron ore mines of the Pilbara, and just this week to the gas fields of Western Downs in Queensland. In China, I've met many Chinese who invest in Australia, and I've been struck by the number of times they tell me how much they value Australia's stable and transparent business and investment environment. Over the past 4 years, the Australian government, through the Foreign Investment Review Board, has approved more than $80 billion in Chinese investment, including in businesses and real estate. And that equates to some 380 individual investment applications, with the vast majority of them from Chinese state-owned enterprises. In 2010-11, China was Australia's third largest source of foreign direct investment applications, behind the US and the UK, but China still only accounts for around 2.5% of the stock of foreign direct investment in Australia. Chinese outbound investment is really just beginning, and if Australia, as a significant capital importing nation, is going to continue to attract investment from China, we will need to remain welcoming and competitive. And indeed, I think we will need to become more welcoming and more competitive. Investment, of course, is not just about how many billions of dollars are committed to major projects. It's also about strategic investment by both countries in the future of our relationship. It's about what I call good policy making. In this 40th anniversary year, it's a good time to look back and see the longer-term impact of significant decisions taken by government and business leaders in earlier times. Significant decisions such as that to establish diplomatic relations in 1972, and other significant decisions, and I'm sure many of you in this room will be able to think of your own examples. But in Victoria's case, I think particularly of CITIC's investment in the Portland aluminium smelter in 1986. That was China's first major overseas investment, although I think people in WA would probably argue that China was, possibly even got there first. But more than 25 years after this landmark event, CITIC is still in Portland, a testament to China's long-term commitment. Another example of good policy making, the Australia-China partnership of 13 years ago to secure approved destination status for Chinese tour groups to visit Australia, opening greater opportunity for Australia and for new people-to-people links. More recently, the agreement between our central banks in March this year to support trade and investment through the bilateral currency swap mechanism. And I'd also point in future to the opening both of the Australian Consulate General and Victoria's Trade and Investment Office in Chengdu next year. These will be gateways to China's rapidly growing West. Of course, Sid mentioned what else is going on this week in addition to the CUP, and yesterday China's leaders began a leadership transition in a peaceful, deliberate and orderly way for only the second time in China's modern history. And as the 2,270 delegates to the 18th Chinese Communist Party's Congress took their seats yesterday in the Great Hall of the People on Tiananmen Square and started to deliberate the key issues facing China, they doubtless will have had in mind some of the major economic and political challenges of the next 5, 10 and even 50 years. Challenges such as how to build the right conditions for continued economic development in the years ahead, to reduce poverty and income disparities and create a secure and prosperous future for China's growing population. How best to manage the difficult process of China's economic rebalancing towards a more sustainable consumption-led growth. How China should seek to engage the international community on the key security, economic, environmental and development challenges we collectively face. What China's incoming leaders do know is that China will continue to change and change dramatically. So for China watchers, whether cabinet ministers, diplomats, journalists, researchers at AsiaLink or members of the ACBC, these are exciting times. And I use that word deliberately. China is dynamic and vibrant. Indeed, it's difficult to express the scale and scope of this dynamism and vibrancy without reverting to cliches. It's important, I think, for Australia as a trading relationship in services as well as goods, as a strategic relationship in the Asian century, and as an ever-deepening partnership founded on close relationships between Australians and Chinese in both countries. China is exciting because of the tremendous potential for future growth in all of those areas I've just mentioned and more. And this, of course, is reflected in the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper, which provides a roadmap for Australia to navigate economic and social change that flows from Asia's rise. Now, in this audience, and I'm speaking in all the major East Coast capitals and Adelaide this week, I don't think there's any need for me to summarise the white paper for you. I'm assuming that you've read it, or at least the executive summary, and that you're well on your way to ploughing your way through the rest of the document, ending up with those tremendously interesting appendices at the end. But one of the messages I really want to be talking about in Australia this week is, I think particularly for an audience like this one, it's important that you all, and I would politely and respectfully ask you all, about your own personal Asian century plan, personal, institutional, business. Many of you, I think, have got pretty well developed, very sophisticated and in many cases highly successful plans already. But whatever you think of the particular content of the white paper, I really think it's worth thinking through in the sort of deliberate way one has to with China. It's so big, there are so many opportunities, but I think everyone in this room has an in, everyone in this room can make a contribution, and I hope you are all, without the need for any encouragement from me, well on the way to doing that. I know both AsiaLink and the ACBC made submissions to the white paper process. I won't go through those again because I'm probably speaking to the very people who wrote them. But I do hope you feel, now that it's been published, that your suggestions and contributions, your policy ideas have been listened to, and I hope you'll be part of the implementation process. I should also mention, though, that we focus, of course, naturally, because we live here, most of us, that on the work being done in Australia. But I just want to mention, particularly as David Olsen, Chairman of Auscham Beijing, is also in the audience. And none of these people have been planted, by the way. You're just here because this is the way the relationship with China works. But Auscham is doing a fine work in promoting Australia's interests in China. It's got coverage across the country, and I think there's a plan for a Chengdu chapter opening soon. Our ties with China are substantial, broadened by the passage of years and made robust and resilient by the perseverance and drive of individuals. There's genuinely close and positive engagement at the political level, and again, because I want to allow enough time for questions, I won't detail precisely what that's been, but there have been something like 50 visits by federal government ministers in the last 4 years, 16 since I've been ambassador, 4 premier visits in the space of a couple of months in the middle of this year, and of course the Chinese are continuing to send senior people to Australia too. I think they're making a real effort to become Australia literate. It is worth mentioning, though, just on the subject of high-level visitors, that in my first month as ambassador last year, I welcomed the Governor of Victoria, the Premier of Victoria, and the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, all on separate visits, but leading me to wonder whether I'd been appointed ambassador for Australia or ambassador for Victoria. Supporting all of the high-level engagement are more than 30 formal high-level mechanisms governing the broad range of our bilateral activities. And there's much more I could say about our defence relationship, but I do want to point out that Australia is one of only 2 countries in the world to have an annual defence strategic dialogue at the level of Chief of the Defence Force and Chief of the General Staff. So I can characterise the future of our relationship and the future of China as strong, dynamic, exciting and full of potential. We are already several years into the Asian century. Looking back now, 40 years after the beginning of the formal bilateral relationship, we can really only marvel, I think, at the scale and scope of the achievements and the benefits each country has received. Victoria can and is playing a leading role in the next chapter of this remarkable story. It has the creativity, the potential, the focus, and last but not least, the breadth and depth that comes from its multicultural heritage and targeted engagement. I look forward to seeing what the future will bring, and I know that if Australia and if Victoria and China are involved, it will be exciting and well worth the wait. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Her Excellency Frances Adamson, for this very insightful and really interesting insider's perspective and years of experience. And as I was really inspired by the fact that you were saying that you travel so much. Actually, I was in fact even envious that we couldn't do that sort of thing from Australia. So I think. What Frances has been telling us is that there's such a tremendous change and development over all aspects of our relationship with China, and your perspective from the Australian insider point of view is really useful. So maybe I will now call on our audience. If you have any question, I'm sure you will be very happy to answer them. Any questions? Yes, Alice. Yes, right.
Asia Link. My question to you, Ambassador, is we spent a lot of time on last over 12 months for the white papers. A lot of people in Australia got a lot of input. I just want to know whether through the embassies, have the embassy asked for the Asian countries, what do they think about Australia in Asian century?
Sure. Well, look, the white paper, as you point out, has been in preparation for, just over a year. In the process of developing the white paper, though, Ken Henry and his team visited Beijing and had, we threw everything possible at them. We had them for 3.5 days, and they had a series of really excellent high-level meetings across the Chinese system with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Commerce, the Communist Party International Department, the People's Liberation Army at senior levels, the think tanks, CAS, scholars, Australian business people. We really tried to give them an opportunity to understand China from every possible angle. So part of the answer to the question is, even in the development of it, the Chinese were given an opportunity to sort of state their views, which they did very openly and constructively and in a very, very good spirit, actually, talking about how they see the role of China developing. I then, as the process neared its end, was instructed to brief them so that we had a clear basis for going forward. The Chinese media is very active, of course, and they're not just interested in 18th Party Congress news. So we made sure that as the Prime Minister was getting to her feet in Australia, we were sending out the executive summary in Chinese, her press release in Chinese, a press release of my own. In the Australian system, an ambassador wouldn't necessarily have the temerity to welcome something that the Prime Minister says, but that works quite well in the Chinese system, so I did. And the reaction has been, I think, largely positive. I mean, as you know, once news starts to spread, we wanted to make sure that they had a good, clear, factual understanding of what the content was in relation to China. Chinese news agencies, of course, are represented in Australia, so they picked all of that up. And there's been, some initial comment Most of it pretty positive, some of them saying, well, let's see the colour of their money, but that's fair enough too, and we'll show them, so that's not a problem. So overall, I think, they've been engaged and interested in the process, and we've sent out literally hundreds of copies of the executive summary in Chinese under covers of letters from me to all the people we think need to know about this. And believe me, every conversation I have within the Chinese system, every conversation visiting Australian ministers have, probably forevermore, will make a mention of the white paper.
Thank you, Excellency, for the wonderful presentations and comprehensive one. I've learned a lot from your presentations about your two-way trade between Australia and China. The things that I would like to ask you is about there are three issues. First one is about the trade balance between Australia and China. And you mentioned the volume is about around $14 billion. But I would like to, maybe you can, in more details on the trade balance, as well as what are the main commodities that, or main products that you export or import from China. The third one is, I see that the investor of China is very attractions on the mining sectors in Australia. But what is your main aims, main objective on your investment in China? And what sector? Besides that, China has a very big populations, a very big market, and also has a low labor costs. Besides that, what are your main attractions? Thank you.
Okay, well, Consul General, thank you very much for those questions. I might answer them, if you don't mind, very briefly to enable us to have maximum number of questions. Otherwise, it will look as if I'm trying to get out of here, which I promise I'm really not. But the trade figures I gave were actually just for Victoria. For Australia as a whole, bilateral trade with China on the most recent figures was $121 billion. And Australia is in a very sort of healthy position when you look at countries globally trading with China. We had a surplus of $33 billion last year. Main export item, I mean, the absolute standout is iron ore, worth $43.5 billion. The other notable items, coal, gold, wool, traditional exports. Services worth about, bilateral services trade about $7.5 billion, substantial earners of tourism and education income for Australia, but there's some services going in the other direction as well. So it's big, it's growing, it's diversifying, and we think there are many more opportunities. In terms of our own inward investment into China, well, I mean, I could almost say, please put up your hand if you're investing in China, and I think there'll be a lot of hands go up. But certainly all the Australian banks, we've got manufacturers, BlueScope Steel, we've got Australian architectural firms who are really making a difference to, including a number from Melbourne, to China's cityscapes. But there continue to be barriers around entry, particularly in the services sector. So all the things that you will know from your own experience that Australia is good at, we do in China. We just want to be able to do more of them.
Ambassador, once again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation here today. Delightful to have you here. From a corporate Australia perspective, there's been a lot of discussion over many years around a free trade agreement, and there's more focus on it going forward. Just want to get your perspective, your personal perspective, having engaged with the senior Chinese leaders, whether you think there is momentum from the China side, whether it's realistic, and you know, is it something that we should focus more on, or look at something else? Thank you. Okay.
No, I almost, in response to the previous question, started to talk about the FTA, but I decided I was bound to get a question on it. So thank you for asking it, Jason. I mean, we've been in the process of negotiating an FTA with China now for over 5 years, and we've had 18 rounds of negotiations. And Australia has sort of started this process anyway with some quite significant ambitions for a high-quality, broad-ranging agreement. when I arrived in China, I think as I started to do my introductory calls, I certainly got the sense that the Chinese remain very interested in this, particularly given the state of the global economy. I mean, they're looking for growth, and obviously successful FTAs can produce continuing growth over time. Now, I've obviously had some particular insights into the process, and I can say that at the sort of ministerial level, both countries are very engaged in this. Both trade ministers are very engaged in this. But we are up against some things that this typically happens as one progresses through a free trade agreement negotiation, against some issues on both sides which are difficult to resolve. And on the Chinese side, there are things like access for agricultural products. We're an efficient producer. I constantly try and convince them, because it's true, that if all of Australia's exported agricultural produce went to China, it would only be sufficient to feed the people of Shanghai. So really, it's nothing to worry about, but obviously we know there are other countries where agricultural sectors are quite sensitive, and they are very, very firm on that. Similarly, we do want better access for Australia's services industries. They're not willing to grant that. And of course, on the Chinese side, there are investment, on the Chinese list, investment and movement of natural persons issues, which would be difficult to resolve at the moment. But we continue to discuss this and to look for opportunities to move it forward. I mean, the Premier of Victoria is inclined to hold me personally responsible for the lack of an FTA so far. He's been very clear with me on this, and I'm reporting back to him later this afternoon on progress. So, I mean, I would obviously very much like to see it done on my watch, and if an agreement can be reached between both governments to make it happen, we will grab it.
Thanks, Ambassador, for your wonderful speech. Just during your speech, I think you pointed out very interesting is to attract more Chinese investments and capitals to invest in our country, as Australian. You mentioned that we need to be more welcoming and more competitive. So do we know what our competitors are doing? For example, Canada's and the States. Obviously, Australia is not the first country to realize the Asia rise, and China rise as well. If we do, and how can we cope with this, and what's our competitive advantage when we compare to these countries? Thanks.
Okay. That's a good question, actually, because Chinese investment funds are flowing out of China and seeking good returns globally. Australia's actually done remarkably well in what I think is really a relatively early stage of this process, and the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, statistics show that Australia is the single largest destination for Chinese investment over the last sort of 4 years or so. So I think we've actually done pretty well. What I was saying is, going forward, I think we're going to need to be more welcoming and more competitive, because Chinese investment is also flowing into other countries. But I think, to be frank with you, other countries are also having to think about the sorts of issues that are generating public debate in Australia. And some countries screen inward investment. Some countries have many countries have a range of ways of dealing with this. The Chinese are becoming more knowledgeable about the different processes and arrangements in each country, but fundamentally they're looking for good returns. And typically in the early stages they've found them in Australian resources projects, but I think we'll see over the next 10, 20, 30 years, just as we have with previous waves of investment, whether from the US, the UK, the Netherlands, Japan, Korea, the United States even, it's sometimes controversial. Everyone then settles down and gets on with it, and investment then flows where there are returns. So I think there are lots of opportunities, and I think, I hope we'll get, at least our fair share and hopefully more.
Perhaps we might have time for one or more, two questions from the audience. Yes, there.
Thanks.
Ambassador Andrew Holden from The Age. You spoke of the Chinese appreciation of the transparency of our business environment. We're reading a great deal at the moment around the issues of corruption in China. Can you talk to us about the significance of that debate and whether, in fact, there is any process or involvement that the Australian institutions might have that would serve them and us?
It's a very good question. And the first thing just to say, I mean, it's obviously quite striking. Part of my role is to get to know companies which are investing in Australia, doing business with Australia. So I do have quite a lot of contact with state-owned enterprises. And I must say, relatively early on in my term, when the first one said to me, we really appreciate the openness and transparency in Australia. We appreciate, the rule of law in Australia and your robust democracy. And I think that was actually said around a time when our democracy was actually quite robust. That can come as a striking sort of comment, but of course it makes good sense from a business point of view. The comments that you refer to, drawing on Hu Jintao's work report at the 18th Party Congress yesterday, I think are very much to the fore in the minds of party leaders and party members, obviously influenced by recent events, but not solely influenced by recent events. I mean, China's leaders have long been alert to the corrosive effect of corruption, and I think if you were to look back over speeches over previous congresses and in all the other areas where these things are discussed, including the National People's Congress in March every year, you would find similar references. But it is quite interesting that across the Chinese system, and I wouldn't want to exaggerate the extent to which it's being done or necessarily the scope of it, but throughout the system there are people at various levels of government and various institutions, some of them non-governmental organisations, but in other cases governmental organisations, which are being very thoughtful about these sorts of issues and continuing to develop, because this has been going on for a long time, links with foreign organisations which can assist in capacity building in this area. So, for example, the New South Wales Information Commissioner was in Beijing over the summer as a guest of the Carter Institute, running a series of seminars at Peking University and in other places about access to information, citizens' access to information. Across the board, whether it's the United Nations Development Programme, the World Bank, various other international organisations and NGOs operating in China. These are live issues, and there is a considerable amount of capacity building going on, whether it's in the development of laws, the implementation of laws, capacity building amongst local officials. It's not something that is particularly sort of headlined, but it is interesting if you tune into that wavelength just to find out how much is going on. And the reasons are obvious in a way, because the netizens, over 500 million people in China have access to the internet, and there are thought to be something like 400 million regular users of Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter. People are alert to these things, practices that they don't like, and they don't hesitate to draw them to official attention. So I see all of those things as positive, and yes, there are points of interaction across the system, but again, I wouldn't want to overstate the extent to which they are likely to result in rapid change.
Maybe that's one very last question at the back.
Ambassador Peter Tai from The Age newspaper. Okay.
He was concerned about the fast development on the seaside and the slow development in the centre of China. My question is, how is that playing out now, and how do you see it in the next 20 years?
Well, I think China's been pursuing for some time a Go West strategy, and I think those of you who've personally had an opportunity to visit China's West will see what an impact that has had and continues to have, and it was one of the reasons why Prime Minister Gillard announced earlier this year that Australia would establish a Consulate General in Chengdu, because although that's not as far west as you can go, it still qualifies as the West, and it's a hugely dynamic part of the country. But of course Chinese leaders themselves remain, and not just leaders, but concerned about growing income disparities between East and West, exactly the sorts of things that Deng Xiaoping would have had in mind. So, but there's very visible evidence of tremendous infrastructure development, of fast trains going west, of networks of toll roads, of all sorts of infrastructure, which is why one of the messages the Embassy consistently gives to all of our visitors, whether they're visiting ASX boards or university vice-chancellors or whoever, is don't just think in China about developing new links with Beijing, Shanghai and Guangzhou. Think about the second and third tier cities, and particularly think about the West. Now, I think we're developing a new rule, which is one question from any organisation. So I think we've had our question from The Age, and we'll take a question from somewhere else. For my final question.
Any final questions? Yes.
David.
David Olsen, Ozgem Beijing and King and Wood Mallesons. Thank you for your little plug for Ozgem Beijing, much appreciated. We've spoken a lot about the need for Australians to be Asia literate, China literate, but I smiled when I heard your comment about Chinese needing to be Australia literate, and that struck a note for me. Any suggestions on what we in this audience, here in Australia, can do to help Chinese companies, China generally, become more Australia literate?
That's a good question, and thank you for spotting a sort of possibly far deeper meaning that I intended in those words. But you are onto something that I'm quite thoughtful about as well too, and it really goes to the sustainability of Chinese investment in Australia, and obviously the extent to which investing companies really from anywhere around the world are able to be attuned to their local communities, attuned to sensitivities within those communities where they exist, they are more likely to be successful. And I think that's a message. I mean, I find myself saying over and over again, Australia welcomes foreign investment. Foreign investment review boards willing to sit down with you and talk about our requirements at an early stage of your interest, and please be aware that of the need to work with communities. And I see that happening increasingly with Chinese companies. Some of them, though, are at the stage where they know that there's something they need to do, but they don't quite know what. So I would simply encourage, you all, to continue to engage with Chinese companies as you clearly have up until now, to show them the sort of welcome and hospitality here in Australia that we regularly receive when we visit China, and for those of us who live there, that's all the time. It may be, though, that there are more sophisticated ideas that can be developed around that. But what I see, particularly from the sort of younger generation of CEO leaders who just are driven, and I think of the president of China Southern Airlines, for example. He's about a year ago, he brought a cohort of Australians up to train them not to be formal cabin stewards, but to be able to be on hand on flights to make Australian passengers feel welcome. He sought my advice about which Australian wine he should serve on his flights. I've put him in touch with some experts you'll be pleased to hear. But I think there are Chinese who want to do those things, and I think we'll see more and more examples. But the extent to which we can help show them the way, I think, is very much in our mutual interests.
Okay, I think I'm going to bring this Q&A to a conclusion, and I'd like to thank the Ambassador for sharing her very insightful perspective.